Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Real Talk, our weekly campus video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. And all of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and our Facebook page via a YouTube link. So today we have two amazing guest speakers. They are also from our Women's Center staff. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute. But the reason we have our two guest speakers today is because today's topic or theme of the episode is talking about how interpersonal violence can show up in the LGBTQ plus community. And so both of our colleagues here have backgrounds in working with the LGBTQ plus community. So we wanted to have this conversation with them today. So thank you so much for being here. We're so excited. So Beck, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then Cameron, go alphabetically for whatever reason.
Okay, thank you for having us. So my name is Beck, and I go by she, they pronouns. And before coming to the Women's Center, for 2 years, I worked at my university's Pride Center. So as a student ambassador, I did a lot of program development on any topics related to the LGBTQ plus community. One of those things was creating and facilitating safe zone trainings for faculty, staff, and students, also serving as a student resource for LGBTQ students on campus for like peer support. Then I had a year-long internship with the Connecticut Department of Children and Families, and during that year I did work a little bit with LGBTQ youth. And now at the Women's Center, over the summer, Cara, Cameron, and I sat down and we did some hours worth of training for staff at the Women's Center, as well as creating some video content for the community. And that includes a YouTube series that I did, if you want to check it out on our channel, where we actually dive deeper into healthy relationships and dating violence. So if that's something that you want to learn more about, you can do it through there as well.
Yeah, awesome. I know, I really loved our trainings over the summer. We put so much thought and effort into that. So that was awesome. And Cameron is our newest, maybe, I think, employee to the Women's Center, and started right when the pandemic hit. So I don't even know if we've met in person, actually. I think we've only communicated over Zoom and virtually.
Right. No, I think,
I wasn't in your interview, but obviously heard lovely things about you, and from the work I've had with you virtually, I think you're an amazing asset to the team. But it's so funny the way that you've kind of started with it.
And that really put it into perspective. I don't think I realized we hadn't met in person. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But, yeah. But yeah, so thank you for having us. I'm very excited. And like I mentioned, my name is Cameron. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the newest to the Women's Center, but I do have a few years experience working within the LGBTQ community. I guess it started in college when I studied women and gender studies, and a huge part of that is LGBTQ or queer studies. So I learned a lot about history and just different identities and things like that. And then I interned at my school's LGBTQ center, where it was a really small place, so I kind of did a little bit of everything. I was very active in a lot of the support groups we ran. So that was a really cool experience. Then after that, I worked for a LGBTQ youth shelter in New York City. So I did development stuff, but I was very active within the population there as well. And here I am now.
Yay! We're so happy to have you both. It's awesome. You're both somewhat newer to the agency, which is so cool. And yeah, I love hearing your backgrounds and kind of the work that you've done. Obviously, we're going to be talking about dating abuse and sexual violence and how that shows up in the LGBTQ plus community. But you obviously worked with the homeless population as well. And I feel like that's hugely linked, right, with obviously interpersonal violence for people of all identities, but particularly in the LGBTQ plus community. So maybe that's a good place to start, kind of in I don't know if that's okay if we can dive into, and you can talk a little bit about the work you did with that population, but just how homelessness kind of exists within the community and why, and how that's linked to, domestic or sexual violence. I know that's a very heavy loaded question right off the bat, so wherever you both want to start with it.
I mean, I can start. So this could be a whole episode, but I guess I'll try to sum it up. So, I mean, one thing that disproportionately affects LGBTQ youth, especially when it comes to homelessness, is the majority of people who came to utilize their services had been kicked out of their home. And that's something you can see, for many different reasons, but I think that's something that disproportionately affects LGBTQ youth. So a lot of people, you know, were 16, 15, 14 out on the street and having to figure out how to survive. So a lot of them had unfortunately encountered experiences that ended up being, you know, sexually violent in nature and things like that. A lot of them engage in survival sex and things like that. So that definitely disproportionately affects the community, and it was a huge impact on these kids' lives.
Yeah. And for our audience, I'm glad you mentioned survival sex, because I was thinking about the link with human trafficking and sex trafficking, and how particularly like LGBTQ folks and people of color, and I kind of hold both of those identities in some way, are disproportionately impacted by that. And survival sex, for those who don't know and watching this, is essentially when someone is taken advantage of, you know, for something of value that they need to survive. So that can be food, that can be a place to stay. So if there is someone who is living on the street and they got kicked out of their home, they're 15, 16 years old, and they're trying to survive, and someone exploits them, right, takes advantage of them sexually for that something in exchange, that is a form of sex trafficking. But a lot of people are not able to really like identify that and kind of like recognize that that's what's happening to them, and or that it happens in Connecticut. And I know you worked in New York City, like not too far from here. So yeah, really common.
We were even in that training yesterday, Cara, and that the woman had said, you know, people are being forced into prostitution versus like that term of survival sex.
Yeah.
And so that was just something that kind of was ringing for me, because I'm glad we took a second to kind of break that down and explain it, because there's even people in these positions who are doing trainings who might mislabel that kind of experience too.
Yeah, language matters, right? So yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for providing that perspective too. And I think like we want to talk obviously about what interpersonal violence looks like for people in the LGBTQ community. So maybe starting with dating abuse, like, are there any kind of unique ways that it shows up in LGBTQ relationships? And like, how does that kind of look? Like, what are some of the examples maybe?
Go like for it. My hand
Like, raise your hand.
To kind of add to what's been said though about homelessness is that, you know, with domestic violence, with dating violence, you know, a queer survivor very may well not have anywhere to go, quite literally. Yeah. So with a barrier to leaving, right? So in addition to being rejected by family, they might be isolated from their friends, right? Because this person is abusive. And then going back to seeking shelter. You know, most places have a women's shelter and then a men's shelter. So where is that queer person going to go? Where are they going to feel the most comfortable? And then on top of it, because of stereotypes, are they going to be seen as predatory and other things by residents? Are they going to feel safe at that shelter? So that feeds into the stats that we see about sex trafficking and survival sex and all of that. So it's just like this ongoing cycle. But some specific forms of abuse that, you know, I have seen through my, you know, friends, working with youth, working with other students, and at the Women's Center is one thing I want to bring up is that queer people may not always date other queer people. So a unique form of abuse that we see is cultural and identity abuse. So especially say we have a bisexual woman who's dating a straight cisgender man, right? You know, her partner could very well have homophobia or transphobia, and that's being projected onto her. Maybe there's an erasure of her identity, right? So that's something that we can see as like an added layer to dating violence, is the erasure of that identity or the invalidation of your identity through different ways. But one of the stories that I do want to bring up in this is, you know, sometimes what I see is kind of this vulnerability with people that are new to the community or they just recently came out. You know, these individuals are particularly vulnerable. So I had a friend of mine who came out a few years ago as lesbian, and I referred to her as like a baby gay. And so she was, you know, dating around, going on social media, you know, swiping back and forth on dating apps. And she started talking to this girl very quickly. After 2 weeks of talking, they're in a committed monogamous romantic relationship, and they're very serious. But she's dated guys before, and when she dated guys, that was not a thing. It took like months, you know, for them to get into a relationship. And so as a friend, I just very bluntly told her, especially after a few months later, seeing how abusive this relationship manifested, I told her that she was being love bombed in the beginning. Because that's what I saw, where it wasn't this genuine energy of showering someone with compliments and gifts and attention. It was to get her into this relationship very quickly. And what I found out was that her abusive partner was telling her that this was normal in a lesbian relationship, in relationships with queer women, that this is actually called U-hauling, that it's typical or it's normal for queer women to rush into relationships. And in fact, with queer women, you know, this is something that is adopted, something that's even seen as the butt of a joke, that this is just how these relationships are. So I want to challenge people that are listening today to think about stereotypes, think about the status quo, and call it into question, because I personally and professionally feel that rushing into a relationship after just a few weeks of dating someone, you're possibly missing some major red flags or things that could be a deal breaker. And it's okay to talk to someone for months and then decide you don't want to have a relationship with them. Doesn't mean you wasted anyone's time. It just means you're looking for the right relationship and not just any relationship. Because that's something that I have seen as like a unique form of dating abuse, is where we're normalizing these really problematic behaviors, you know, and something that, you know, it really isn't okay regardless of who it is.
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting perspective, because Cara and I have conversations all the time with clients or together, or I've seen her talk about it in education programs, is like that the speed or the intensity of it in a relationship in the beginning maybe is a sign, right? It might be a red flag. I think we've kind of put information about that in our like brochures and stuff like that. So even, you know, I'm really glad that you brought that perspective up and that you use the terms like love bombing or U-hauling, because they're not things that I've necessarily had as a part of like my vocab all the time, but it does kind of mirror the way we talk about like intensity and speed at which someone is trying to get you into a relationship, right? That could be a warning sign of abuse.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought I liked the piece that you brought up too about just like the community in and of itself. Like I have heard that from friends as well, of feeling like that erasure of their identity. If like the exact example you gave of like a bisexual woman, let's say, in a relationship with a cisgender man, feeling from their friends and even within the LGBTQ community, feeling like their identity is not valid, like, oh, you're not, you know, a part of the community, or like feeling outcasted in some way.
I have a thought really quick, sorry. Maybe it would be helpful if we kind of explained the term erasure and like what that might look like.
That's a great thought. I love it. Would either of you like to take that one?
So I can speak to it. So erasure is kind of just not allowing someone to fully express their identity in the way that they want to, or minimizing it. It can look a lot of different ways, but I think that's a perfect example. Like, you know, if there's a relationship and someone is a, say, cisgender man in their relationship with a bisexual woman, you're telling her, you know, you're not actually bi when you're with me, or something like that, as an example of erasure, saying that identity is not real, that it doesn't have value.
Yeah. And I don't know, you know, yeah, thank you for that's a great idea to define some terms. Well, and I think that's part of like I'm so glad we're having this episode and this conversation, because I think that's part of the conversation, is learning the language and being really aware of the unique barriers, challenges, things that exist for people in the LGBTQ community. And especially, like you were saying, Beck, of if someone is new to the community, they're kind of recognizing their own identity or learning their own, exploring their own identity, they may not be familiar with a lot of these things as well. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Are there any other pieces that we kind of want to touch on in terms of like dating abuse and what can exist for folks in that community?
Yeah, I have a quick one if there's time. So I think like, I mean, there's obviously so many different ways that it can look, but I think one unique form of abuse that can happen is if in a relationship, one of the people is trans or maybe non-binary, someone who's not cisgender, and they're using hormones or transitioning another way. If, you know, the abuser messes around with that and could even hide hormones or force them to take hormones or not to take hormones, that could be a very physical form of abuse. Yeah. Or even, you know, sort of in that more cultural or emotional way, if in a fight the abuser uses the wrong pronoun on purpose, or says, you know, you're not a real man, you're not a real woman, language like that, purposely attacking that person's identity.
Right. So the pieces of like emotional abuse too, that might be even more layered. And I think too, the one thing that was coming up in my mind as well was like threatening to out someone so that you'll stay in the relationship, either to your family or, just to the community in general, is gotta be also another huge piece or tactic of manipulation or abuse that abusers are using, that they do use.
Yeah.
I would even say pressuring someone to come out or to not come out or something like that.
Just talking about this recently with someone, and like it's an interesting dynamic for sure. Like at what point is that boundary? Obviously, it's never okay to cross somebody's boundary, but it's certainly a unique part of LGBTQ plus like people's lives.
Yeah, and like the process of coming out, I think people like are getting a little bit more understanding of the fact that it's not like a one-time thing, like it's constant and it's in different environments with different people. And it may be like, we did an episode a few weeks ago about like disclosing that you've experienced trauma in a way that's kind of, like you might share pieces of it. You might share with only some people you trust, with some people you feel comfortable with, or only sharing it because of a safety concern. And it's kind of similar coming out with your identity in some way. It's a safety concern for people. And I don't know why, not to jump to the next subject too quickly, but it was making me think about barriers to reporting sexual violence for people in the LGBTQ community, that fear of like, if I report this, I'm outing myself, right? Or like, if I report this, I may not be taken seriously, or I may be, like not helped, right? Because they won't even take my identity seriously enough to take my report seriously. So I'm not to shift, away from dating abuse, but that just popped into my head about, sexual violence too, and just like the barriers with that.
It does connect to it because, boundaries are not just important for everyone, but especially for queer people, right? Because it can be a safety concern, whether it's their name, their pronouns, or even stuff that has to do with their body, right? So it's really important that when you're dating a queer person that you have a conversation of the who, the what, and the where. So who can I discuss our relationship with? Where can I discuss it? Online, in person, what settings can we hold hands or not hold hands? So the who, what, and where, is really important. And when it comes to your body too, and that goes back to sexual violence, which I'm glad we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I love that, the who, what, where. That's awesome. I feel like that's a really tangible, helpful thing to like bring to a relationship, right? Of like, hey, let's discuss this. Because it just, that shows in and of itself that something that is a privilege that a lot of like cisgender heterosexual couples or people don't have to have, well, maybe in some way, but obviously not so much in a safety concern, right? Like they have those conversations about boundaries, PDA, whatever, but it's not because, well, we can get, attacked if we're out in public and kissing or holding hands, right? And that's so sad and frustrating and you're still raising
not to like, unless we really want to talk more on dating violence to kind of move into sexual violence. I think what we're talking about is kind of getting my gears going.
Yeah, go for it.
But something that I did want to talk about is that erasure can become violent, right? So think about it if we have someone who identifies as asexual. So if anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's just a lack of sexual attraction. But even for asexual people, there's kind of like, it's an umbrella term, that there's some people that are still open to certain types of sexual activity, or, maybe they really need to get to know someone before that's something that they would consider. Intimacy looks different for everybody. Right. So sometimes, erasure of someone's asexuality could be seen as a partner trying to guilt them and pressure them and coerce them into having sex, right? Yeah. So, and then going back to Cameron's example with the hormones, right? That is something that is physically hurting your body. So that I would consider physical violence at that point, not just emotional abuse or corporal abuse. So, dating violence with queer people can look all sorts of ways, but even sexual violence too, because we talk about how sexual violence is based in power and control. But there's an added layer that I've seen when working at DCF, when working at the Pride Center, is that there's also a corrective motivation to sexual violence against queer people.
I was just going to bring that up, of the corrective rape and how freaking awful it is. Like, it's just so horrible. Yeah.
That sometimes, there's sexual violence or even sexual harassment, these little microaggressions that we hear sometimes, oh, I can change you. You just haven't met the right guy or girl yet. How do you know if you've never been with a guy or a girl or whatever? These things are inherently sexual, and they're also very corrective, where it's making you feel like you're not allowed to be who you are and who you truly are. And that can become sexual violence as well, through rape, through actual sexual violence and sexual assault. And that's something to talk about, because it's also based in power and control. And you're not just, sexual violence in general takes people's bodily autonomy away, but it's really kind of adding to it. That's something that queer people directly experience.
Yeah. Cameron, I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts on that, based on the work that you've done, or things that you've seen in the work that you do, on what she was just explaining.
I think Beck did a really good job of explaining it. Yeah, honestly, I think Beck really summed it up.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I don't even see that. I wonder what our other guest speaker has.
It's so funny though, because I was just having this conversation with someone the other day about appropriate and inappropriate like language, and where it crosses the line into sexual harassment, and how I saw a lot when I was in college, like people, I always mess this word up, but fetishizing, like making a fetish out of particularly girls, if they're lesbians or bi, or even if they're, experimenting, exploring, whatever. And it was like used for people's entertainment, which is so disgusting and awful. And then on the double standard of that is that it was, if there was the opposite, where there were two guys kissing or making out, it was responded with either violence or aggression, right? Or like not accepting of that, let alone for trans folks, like it's using them as a joke, right? Like there's just so much violence on the receiving end for the LGBTQ community, whereas I think people have a misconception that they think they're like you were saying before, Beck, of like that they're the ones kind of being the predatory person, when in reality the violence in the LGBTQ community is significantly higher sometimes in the cis or heterosexual community, and that it's not really talked about, which is why I'm so glad we're having this conversation. But I think for maybe our like last part of the conversation today, it's important for us to recognize that this episode is going to be released right before Thanksgiving. Students are going home if they aren't already, and kind of going to be being home for the holidays, and I'm sure that brings up a lot for people of all identities and backgrounds, but wanted to kind of open the floor to you if you have any thoughts, advice, ways to support the LGBTQ community during the holidays and what that might bring up.
So I think that if you're going home and you know that maybe it's not the best environment for you, or you're worried about some things happening, I think one thing you can preemptively do is come up with some kind of safety plan. Figure out places you could go if things are not so great at home. Maybe some people you can reach out to, some friends or some things like that. Of course, if COVID allows it, or even just places that you can go, by yourself that, make you feel better, or coming up with ways that you can practice self-care, and especially focus on self-care more than you normally would. Listing specific things that you can do, I think can be helpful, and make it seem like something that's going home might seem easier if you have those in the back of your mind.
I like that you said like preemptively thinking about it and stuff like that. I talk with clients all the time, and we've mentioned it on Real Talk episodes before, that with self-care, you can plan things out. There's in the moment things you can do, but also, every Tuesday I'm going to do this, or every Friday I'm going to make sure I do that, or I'm going to spend an hour every week reading my favorite book. And sometimes like you said, preemptively building that in instead of doing it to respond to something stressful that might have happened can help us feel like better at a baseline level of just kind of being cared for, even if it's ourselves taking care.
Yeah.
I think when you're stressed or just went through something negative, it can be harder to think and to remember the things that make you feel better and your safety plan. So if you already have it down, then you don't have to worry.
Yeah, I love, and that's something that we can help students with too, right? Like a safety plan may not be familiar to some people. So if you're confused or unsure about like how to go about that, like that's what we're here for, to help kind of walk through what a safety plan can look like. So yeah, thank you for bringing that. I think that's huge. So, and hopefully something people won't need, but we recognize that this is a scary time with COVID alone, let alone for folks that don't feel safe at home and are kind of stuck at home, and so, yeah. Beck, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say I completely agree. Safety planning is everything. Even if you feel like you don't need one, and like the last few years you've gone to the holidays and things have been fine, there has been nothing normal or predictable about 2020. So safety plan anyway. And not just for physical safety, but your mental and emotional health. You do
Right.
not have to surround yourself by people who exhaust you emotionally and drain your energy. I know we talk about how blood is thicker than water, but for the holidays, right? For many people, this is the time of giving thanks and, you know, being surrounded by loving family. But for queer people, for many of us, it can be a time of grief and of sorrow. So even if you are queer and you go home for the holidays and things are fine, know that you're sitting in a place of privilege. So check on your queer friends, especially if you're not queer. Check in on them, see if they have a place to go for the holidays, and if they don't, and if you know that your family would be welcome to it, welcome them with open arms, because I don't want to see anybody spend the holidays by themselves. But really sit there and remind yourself that you do not have to engage with people who do drain you emotionally. Accepting who you are is the bare minimum expectation in any relationship, right? For many of us, family, you know, that love is unconditional, but for queer people, it does become conditional, and that can be very, it can be very exhausting, and, you know, it leads to a lot of confused feelings. But say you do go to the holidays, right? And you have a safety plan, where you're going if things go south, how you're going to get out of there, all of that. Remember that you don't have to engage if for some reason politics or your identity becomes a topic of conversation at the table. Right. Say Uncle Barry had a little too much eggnog and now he's going off the deep end, right? You do not have to engage in that conversation. And I know we talk about how, you know, if we hear a problematic conversation and we don't say anything and we're silent, then you're taking the side of the oppressor. I think that that metaphor should really be brought to people who would be in a place of privilege in that conversation. That
or safety
doesn't affect you.
Yeah, right? I think about that all the time of like, if your safety is going to be at risk for speaking up, even if it's for your own, like, even if it's for defending yourself or whatever, like, if you feel like it's going to put you in danger in any way, whether that's physical danger or emotional danger, right? Like, yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That's so important.
You don't have to be a warrior this holiday. You don't.
Right. Take care of you. Yeah.
I noticed that I'm smiling and everybody else has these serious faces on, but like I just am so happy that you said that, and that like that we talked about the self-care, and like it feels empowering, because I'm thinking like, you know, maybe the terms like an emotional safety plan are not like part of everybody's lingo like they are ours. But like deciding what topics you're going to avoid and giving yourself permission to say, I'm not engaging in that, like no matter what, no matter how, no matter who, because I matter and like how I'm feeling matters and I deserve to feel safe. Like that's an emotional safety plan, right? So there are things people are doing already, whether they are labeling it that as such or not. But like I'm sitting here smiling because I just feel like that was an awesome thing that I'm excited for like people who are going to watch this episode to hear that message. And I think that, like Cara said before, if people need help, if they need support, kind of figuring that out and looking, you know, for advice on what does my safety plan look like, this is the unique situation I'm going to, feel free to reach out and we can help you figure out what that might be. And also we did this last time with Matt and Courtney, and we didn't talk about it beforehand, so I hope it's okay now, but if people watching want to talk to Cameron or Beck specifically, you can reach out to Cara or I, and we will put you in contact with them. I'm assuming that's okay. I see yeses. Awesome, cool. So we won't list it like your emails and stuff here, but we will absolutely provide them if people reach out to us. Cara and my email, they're everywhere. So like we feel that people will be able to get in touch with us if they need it. Does anybody have any other thoughts or things they want to share like before we kind of end this conversation?
One thing I want to add quick, going back to like, you know, safety planning and, you know, contacting us if you ever need anything, including safety planning. In addition to our 2 24-hour hotlines, know that especially during the holidays, look up the Trevor Project if that is a number that you want to reach out to. That is specifically for queer people and for queer youth. It's a suicide prevention hotline, but also they deal with mental health. So if you need someone to talk to, if you need a resource, that's another one for you as well.
Awesome.
Thank you for mentioning that. Anybody else? Anything else?
Yeah, I have a quick thing too. So I think that, you know, like with COVID and everything, it's bringing out a lot of stuff for people. And it can seem very overwhelming and never ending, but you know, we have to remind ourselves this is temporary. This is not our lives forever and our reality forever, and we will get through it and we will see better days. And I think hope can go a long way. So I know that just thinking about that has been helping me. So hopefully can help other people as well.
That just lifted my heart. I really needed to hear that.
Good. It's true. It's true, you know?
You'll get through it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I appreciate that, obviously, for me, because I needed to hear that today, but also for our audience, because I know like college students are really, their safe space can sometimes be campus, like getting away from, you know, harmful or toxic relationships back at home. And so, yeah, holding on to that hope, knowing you're not alone, like we are here for you, all of us here on this call and everyone at the Women's Center, and that, you know, your identity is valid, you matter, and you're loved. And yeah, just thank you both for having this conversation. It's so important.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy we did this. I think that we will make sure we put the phone number for the Trevor Project hotline in the caption when we post this video. I think that would be a great idea.
Yeah.
If you have any other thoughts, questions, or reactions to what we discussed today, or if you'd like to connect with any of us, you can email Cara or I, or you can give us a call on the office phone or our 24-hour hotlines. Remember, these episodes are all recorded and will be available to view on IGTV, YouTube, and Facebook. And you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, things like that. And obviously connect with us via email, phone, or over social media, whatever works for you. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Share this with a friend, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.